Okay. So you've heard about Kant. You've heard about um, his epistemology, his metaphysics. You're familiar with his understanding of free will. So now we're going to get into Kant's ethical system, the categorical imperative. But first, we need to talk about the more general category under which the categorical imperative falls. Kant's categorical imperative is a deontological ethical system. It is what we call a deontology. And the word deon comes from the Greek meaning obligation or duty. It is a duty-based or obligation-based ethical system. So in talking about what a deontology is, essentially a deontology is a non-consequentialist theory of ethics. The consequences do not matter. That that which makes a particular act or rule right or wrong is inherent in the act or rule itself. It is not something external. It's not consequences. It's something in the rule itself, or again, act. So when we think about deontology, we divide it into act and rule deontology. Act deontology is essentially intuitionism. Basically, people are various, situations and circumstances are so various that we cannot generalize rules that would account for all that variation. And then you'll see here 1 through 4, this is the argument that our intuitionists, or the arguments that our intuitionist theorists make in favor of act deontology or intuitionism. And it comes down to, humans have a sense of right and wrong when we're faced with a situation. Also, we were making moral decisions before Kant, before philosophy, right? So how did we do that? Well, and the intuitionists would say, well, we've used our intuitions, right? And then the last reasons are essentially that, when we're faced with a circumstance, we know the right thing to do, right? And that we just use our intellect or our rationality to, on the back end, right? That we use reason simply to support our intuitive understanding of right and wrong. So Kant's theory is a rule deontology, right? There are certain rules that are the basis for moral action, right? There are some generalizable rules for action. Now your text may separate out divine command theory from rule deontology, but essentially divine command theory is a kind of rule deontology, right? That the difference really is simply the origin of the force that gives a rule its moral status, right? For divine command theory, that moral force is divine inspiration, right? This is the right thing to do because God thinks it's the right thing to do, or God wants me to do it, right? So it's, again, still non-consequentialist, right? It's don't kill, full stop, right? What if in killing this person I'd save 100 other people, right? The rule is don't kill. Consequences don't matter. Okay, so Kant's ethics, it is a duty-based ethics that basically he's going to argue that intuitionism fails because humans are inclined differently and we tend to be emotional and irrational at times. So for this reason, or for these reasons, we have to force ourselves to act out of a sense of obligation to the moral law itself, something outside of our own feelings, right? And the unique thing about humans is that we are in fact able to act in accordance with moral rules and principles, regardless of our feelings, regardless of our own individual interests in the matter, and regardless of the consequences, right? And that's, for him, that is the goodwill, and it's something unique to humans. Also, Kant believed that we could establish morality by reason alone. So in the same way that triangles have 3 sides, you must always tell the truth is true, right? You can never lie is true in the same way that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true. Right? And they're both true because they are both in accordance with our human rationality, our ability to reason. So here's some terms for you. First, we have a perfect obligation or a perfect duty. These are things that you're obligated to do always, no matter what, in every circumstance. You are never allowed to break a promise, no matter what. But what if it's going to hurt somebody's feelings? Doesn't matter. You can never break a promise. Next, we have an imperfect obligation or an imperfect duty, and these are things you're obligated to do as often as possible, right? So, not in all cases, but more often than not. So, developing your talents, right? If you are a talented ballet dancer, you have an obligation to develop that talent. Now, if you are good at building improvised explosive devices, we might say no, right? That's a talent you are not obliged to develop, right? So, more often than not. Next, we have what are called hypothetical imperatives. These are commands, these are rules that must be followed to achieve particular goals, right? But these rules are going to vary depending on the goals of the individual, right? So I might say to be successful on an exam, you need to study. Right? Well, you only need to study if you're interested in being successful on an exam. I wouldn't say everyone needs to study. And lastly, we have the categorical imperatives. And these are rules, these are commands that you have to follow in all cases, in every case, because they are in accordance with our reason, our rationality, and they are universalizable. Right? We can universalize these rules. Okay, so that brings us back to Kant's ethical system. Right? Now, Kant's ethics, or the basis for the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant, is that the supreme moral principle is a priori, right? So if you recall those categories of understanding, our ability to determine right and wrong is an outgrowth of our ability to reason. So first, Kant's going to look at other possible So in looking at other ethical systems or ethical theories that are put forth as universal or objective, Kant's going to look at the Golden Rule. And though we often think do unto others as you would want done to you is, everyone can utilize that system, that rule, but Kant's going to argue that it fails in the first two situations. The third one I put in there. Don't attribute that to Kant. So the first is a judge, right? And so if you're a judge and someone's convicted of a crime and you need to now sentence them to a particular amount of jail time, and you want to sentence them to the morally correct amount of jail time using the Golden Rule, then it would be you would sentence people to the amount of jail time that you yourself would like to have. And of course, the result would be probation for everyone. So in the case of a judge, the Golden Rule doesn't help. It doesn't work. And secondly, if you are a consistent egoist, the Golden Rule doesn't help you to determine the right thing to do. That if you're only concerned with yourself, right? You're not concerned with others, you don't want to do for them and them for you, you're only concerned with yourself, and consistently so, then the Golden Rule doesn't give you any method to determine how you should act, right? It requires the other individual, right? And so Kant says in that case, the Golden Rule doesn't work. And then lastly, again, not Kant's example. If you're unfamiliar with masochism, a masochist is an individual who enjoys pain, right? And so you might say, well, if you enjoy pain, I would prefer that you do not use the golden rule when deciding how you would treat me. So again, the first thing Kant's going to do is he's going to look at other universal systems, and he's going to talk about how they aren't necessarily universal, that they fail. So the golden rule fails for Kant. So he postulates the categorical imperative, and he puts this forth as a universal moral system that's based in human reason, our rationality. And so when we talk about the categorical imperative, we talk about it as having three formulations. And really what this means is it's three ways of talking about the same idea. It's like putting language to an idea in three different ways. But when we talk about them as separate, but really they're always talking about, or they're all talking about the same thing. So what we'll do is we'll go through each formulation and then choose an example and utilize each formulation to determine what the morally correct choice would be. You'll just see. So here, the first formulation of universal law. All right, now this requires that when you're facing a dilemma, right, when you're saying, okay, should I do this or this, what it is you're considering doing, right, you would create a universal maxim for that particular choice. Right, so that's the first step, is to create a universal maxim. What if everyone did what you're thinking of doing automatically? So I'll just give you a quick example. So let's say I ask you if I can borrow $10, right? And I say, oh, I promise I'll pay you back the $10. And in my mind, I have no intention of ever paying you back the $10, right? So essentially what I've done is I've made a lying promise, right? So for Kant, in using this first formulation, if I'm thinking, okay, should I make this lying promise or not? What you would do is you would create a universal maxim for what you are thinking about doing. So I'm thinking about making a lying promise. So I create a universal principle. What if everyone automatically, in all cases, when they made a promise, they made a lying promise? What would that world be like? Right? And so you'd say, okay, well, if every promise is a lying promise, that means no one keeps their word. Right? You can't trust anyone when they promise to do something. Right? So essentially, if every promise is a lying promise, there are no more promises. So by my saying that I should make a lying promise in a world where there are no promises, that would be irrational, illogical, contrary to reason. Right? You must have promises in order to have a lying promise. So because that universal maxim is irrational, contrary to reason, it is also immoral. It's wrong to make a lying promise. You must always keep your promises. So making a lying promise is wrong, just like this five-sided shape is a triangle is wrong. It's because it's logically inconsistent. The second formulation of the categorical imperative, most often called the practical imperative, sometimes called ends mean, sometimes called end in itself. Anyway, practical imperative. This asserts that we are disallowed from valuing a rationally thinking thing merely as a means to an end. Right? So two ideas here. The idea of a means and the idea of an end. An end is going to be what has value, what you're trying to achieve, and the means would be the way you achieve that goal. Right? So if I want to eat my soup, right, eating the soup would be my end, and the spoon would be the means, the way I achieve that goal, that thing I value. I don't value the spoon outside of its ability to help me eat my soup. Anyway, so practical imperative asserts that you must treat all rationally thinking things as ends in themselves. Right? And irrationally thinking things are valuable simply by virtue of their existence. So when you're at Cheddar's and there's not enough iced tea or ice in your iced tea, right, you cannot value your server simply because he or she is the vehicle by which you get more ice in your iced tea. You must value that server because he or she is a rationally thinking thing, right? Has the ability to reason. Right? So you also use this as a way to determine a morally correct course of action. Right? You examine the choice you're considering and look to see if you are not treating a rationally thinking thing as an end. Right? So I'll give you an example. Let's see, something that's a real downer, suicide. Right? So if you think about suicide, what is the goal? Right? The goal is, I mean, we have to think, well, the goal is to be dead, but but that's not necessarily the goal. The goal of suicide is an end to suffering or an end to pain or anguish. Right? Now, how do you achieve that goal? Right? Ending suffering or pain. Well, you achieve that goal by killing yourself. So notice that we would be valuing ourselves simply as a means to achieve some other goal. And for that reason, suicide, in Kant's view, would be immoral. You cannot value a rationally thinking thing as a means. You must value rationally thinking things as ends in themselves. Okay, and the last formulation, sometimes called the kingdom of ends, right, works in a couple of ways, but essentially it's a guarantee on the other two. Right? You have, because you are a rationally thinking thing, the capacity to determine right from wrong. Because you have the ability to reason, you can determine right from wrong. And so you are in charge of determining right and wrong. You are disallowed from taking someone else's system of right and wrong and applying it to yourself. Right? You have the tools, i.e. a rational mind, therefore you are in charge. So, as I said, in two ways, it's a guarantee. You have to ensure that you're not using someone else's system, because in that sense you'd be valuing yourself simply as a way for them to have the kind of world that they would want, so possibly a violation of the second formulation. But also, you make decisions as if you're in charge of all the goals for everyone. Right? So that's why it's called the kingdom of ends sometimes, right? So if you were in charge of what everyone did, right, would these be the decisions? Would this be the decision that you would make?